Marco Bellini's footsteps echoed through the marble foyer as he loosened his tie, the weight of another failed business negotiation settling on his shoulders like lead. The Rossetti family had walked away from the shipping deal, leaving him with warehouses full of legitimate cargo and no buyers. At 38, he'd spent the last 5 years trying to build something clean from the ashes of his father's empire, but every door seemed to slam shut the moment they heard the Bellini name. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 8:15. Aurora should be having dinner by now, probably picking at whatever Isolde had prepared while asking 100 questions about his day. His daughter's curiosity had only grown since the accident 2 years ago. Losing her sight had somehow sharpened every other sense, including her ability to detect when he was frustrated. She'd pepper him with gentle questions until he found himself confessing problems he'd never shared with his lieutenants. A strange sound drifted up from the basement, rhythmic and deliberate. Marco paused at the base of the stairs, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol concealed beneath his jacket. The sound came again, thudding, like someone striking heavy bags in rapid succession. He'd converted the basement into a private gym years ago, back when he still believed violence was the only language his world understood. The equipment had gathered dust since Aurora's accident. He'd lost the taste for physical training when his daughter needed him to be gentle, not dangerous. But someone was down there now. Marco descended the basement stairs silently, each step calculated to avoid the creaks he'd memorized during countless late-night training sessions. The sounds grew clearer as he approached the steel door. Definitely impact training. Professional technique from the sound of it. Have you ever wondered what it takes to transform fear into power? Sometimes the answer lies in the most unexpected places, taught by the most unlikely teachers. He pressed his ear to the door. 2 voices. Aurora's bright laugh, mixed with a woman's lower tone offering instruction and encouragement. Isolde. What could his daughter's maid possibly know about combat training? Marco turned the handle slowly and stepped into the basement gym. What he saw stopped him cold. Aurora stood in the center of the mat, her long dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, wearing workout clothes he'd never seen before. She moved with fluid precision, her fist striking a heavy bag with perfect form despite the dark glasses she wore to protect her sensitive eyes. Each punch landed exactly where it should, her stance balanced and controlled. Isolde circled her like a predator studying prey, calling out adjustments in a voice completely different from the soft-spoken woman who served his morning coffee. This version of Isolde moved with lethal grace, her usually modest dress replaced by fitted black clothes that revealed a lean, muscular frame Marco had never noticed beneath her conservative uniforms. Keep your center, Aurora. Feel the bag's position through the vibrations in the floor. Trust your other senses. Aurora shifted her stance slightly and unleashed a combination that would have impressed his former sparring partners. The bag swayed under the impact, chains creaking with the force. Beautiful, Isolde said, genuine pride warming her usually reserved tone. Now let's work on defensive positioning. Marco's throat went dry. His blind daughter was learning to fight. Not the basic self-defense he'd considered teaching her someday, but real combat techniques that required years to master. And his quiet, unassuming maid was teaching her with the expertise of a professional. Papa? Aurora's head turned toward the door with uncanny accuracy. She'd always been able to sense his presence, but this awareness seemed sharper now, more focused. Marco stepped into the light, his mind racing to process what he'd witnessed. Aurora, sweetheart, what's going on here? The confidence drained from his daughter's face, replaced by the defensive expression she wore whenever she thought he might try to protect her from something she wanted to do. She straightened her shoulders and lifted her chin, a gesture so reminiscent of her mother that his chest tightened. I'm learning to fight, she said simply. Isolde moved to Aurora's side with fluid steps that seemed to barely disturb the air. Up close, Marco could see details he'd missed from across the room. Calluses on her knuckles that spoke of years hitting hard targets. A small scar near her left temple. The way she positioned herself to keep both Aurora and the room's exits in her peripheral vision. This woman was not a maid. I can explain, Mr. Bellini, Isolde said, her accent carrying traces of something Eastern European that he'd never noticed during their brief daily interactions. Please do. Marco's voice came out harder than he'd intended, the tone he used with subordinates who disappointed him. Aurora flinched, but Isolde didn't react at all. If anything, she seemed to settle into a more balanced stance. Aurora's been asking me to teach her for months, Isolde continued, her green eyes never leaving his face. She wants to be able to protect herself. She's blind, Marco said, hating how the words sounded but unable to stop them. She could get hurt. The silence that followed felt dangerous. Aurora's jaw clenched, and for a moment she looked exactly like him during his most stubborn teenage years. I've been blind for 2 years, Papa. I'm tired of being helpless. You're not helpless, sweetheart. You're just different. Aurora's voice cracked slightly. Broken? The words hit him like physical blows. He'd spent 2 years trying to protect her from the world's cruelty, building barriers around her life to keep her safe. But maybe he'd built a prison instead. Isolde stepped forward slightly, not enough to seem aggressive, but enough to draw his attention. She has natural ability, Mr. Bellini. Better balance and spatial awareness than most sighted fighters I've known. Most fighters? Marco caught the slip immediately. How many fighters have you known, Isolde? Something flickered in her eyes before she looked away. I've had some experience with self-defense. Aurora moved between them, her hand finding Isolde's arm with practiced ease. Don't blame her, Papa. I begged her to teach me. She kept saying no until I proved I could handle it. Marco watched his daughter's protective stance, the way she naturally shielded the woman who'd been training her. When had Aurora become the protector instead of the protected? How long has this been going on? 3 months, Aurora admitted, her chin rising defiantly. Every evening, while you were working late. 3 months. He'd been so focused on legitimate business deals and keeping distance from his family's criminal past that he'd missed his daughter transforming in his own basement. And his maid, the quiet woman who organized his household with invisible efficiency, had been conducting what looked like professional-level combat training. She's stronger now, Papa. More confident. Ask her to show you the kata sequence. Marco had no idea what a kata sequence was, but he found himself nodding. Show me. Isolde hesitated, then moved to the center of the mat. What followed was unlike anything Marco had ever seen. She flowed through a series of movements that looked like deadly poetry, each strike and block perfectly controlled. This wasn't self-defense. This was the work of someone who dedicated years to mastering violence as an art form. When she finished, the basement felt charged with energy. Marco realized he was holding his breath. Where did you learn that? Isolde's expression shuddered completely. I've had good teachers. Aurora clapped excitedly. She knows 16 different fighting styles, Papa. 16. And she's teaching me to use sound and touch instead of sight. I'm getting stronger every day. Marco looked at his daughter's glowing face, then at the woman who'd somehow unlocked capabilities he'd never imagined Aurora possessed. Isolde met his gaze steadily, but he could see tension in the line of her shoulders. She was waiting for him to forbid the training, to send her away, to choose safety over his daughter's autonomy. But Aurora looked happier than she had since the accident. More alive. How do I know she won't get hurt? Because I won't let her, Isolde said quietly. The certainty in her voice made something in his chest ease. I've been teaching her to know her limits and respect them. She's never been safer. Aurora beamed. And I feel like myself again, Papa. For the first time since the accident, I feel like me. Marco rubbed his temples, feeling a headache building behind his eyes. His quiet life was getting complicated in ways he didn't understand. His daughter was learning to fight from a maid who moved like a professional killer. And despite every protective instinct screaming at him to stop this madness, Aurora looked more confident and capable than she had in 2 years. Fine, he heard himself saying. But I want to observe some of these training sessions. And I want honest answers about your background, Isolde. Isolde nodded slowly. Fair enough, Mr. Bellini. Aurora squealed and threw her arms around him, nearly knocking him off balance. Thank you, Papa. You won't regret this. As his daughter hugged him tight, Marco caught Isolde's eye over her head. The woman's expression was unreadable, but he could have sworn he saw relief mixed with something that looked almost like regret. What had he just agreed to? And who exactly was the woman he'd trusted with his daughter's safety? Those questions would have to wait. For now, Aurora was happy, and that was worth almost any risk. The next morning found Marco seated in his study, staring at a computer screen filled with employment records that told him absolutely nothing useful about Isolde Vance. Her references were impeccable. Previous employers sang her praises. Background checks came back clean as freshly fallen snow. Too clean. He rubbed his tired eyes and reached for his coffee, remembering how she'd moved during Aurora's training session. No domestic worker learned to flow between combat stances with that kind of lethal precision. The way she'd assessed the room's exits, positioned herself for maximum tactical advantage, corrected Aurora's form with the expertise of someone who'd spent years perfecting violence as an art form. Marco had grown up around dangerous people. His father's world had been populated by men who could kill with their bare hands, who moved through life knowing they were apex predators. Isolde carried herself with that same predatory awareness, but she'd hidden it so well that he'd never noticed during 2 years of daily interactions. A soft knock interrupted his brooding. "Come in." Isolde entered carrying a fresh pot of coffee and what looked like homemade pastries. She wore her usual modest gray dress and sensible shoes, dark hair pulled back in a simple bun. The picture of domestic efficiency. But now Marco found himself studying the controlled way she moved, how she kept her back to the wall while serving him, the calluses on her hands that had nothing to do with household work. "Your usual breakfast, Mr. Bellini." Aurora is finishing her morning exercises. Exercises that don't exist on any physical therapy plan her doctors recommended, I'm guessing. Isolde's pause was barely perceptible as she set down his cup. The medical professionals she's seen focus on compensation techniques, learning to navigate the world as a disabled person. They never considered that she might transcend those limitations entirely. Transcend them how? Isolde poured his coffee with steady hands, but Marco caught the slight tightening around her eyes. Aurora's other senses have developed beyond anything I've seen before. Her spatial awareness is extraordinary. She can track multiple moving targets through sound and air displacement alone. Most sighted fighters never develop that level of environmental consciousness. You talk like you've trained many fighters. This time the pause was longer. I've had experience with various martial arts, Mr. Bellini. Aurora has natural gifts that would impress any instructor. Marco leaned back in his chair, studying her face. What kind of experience exactly? Before Isolde could answer, Aurora's voice echoed from the basement. "Papa, can you come watch this?" Something in his daughter's tone made Marco rise immediately. Isolde followed, her movements silent as a shadow. They found Aurora in the center of the mat, facing 3 heavy bags that Isolde must have repositioned during the night. "Watch this, Papa. Isolde taught me to fight multiple opponents using sound mapping." Aurora stood perfectly still for a moment, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something beyond his hearing. Then she exploded into motion. She moved between the bags like water flowing around stones, striking each target with devastating precision while never letting any of them catch her in a vulnerable position. Her fists and feet found their marks with mechanical accuracy, her body flowing from one technique to the next without pause or uncertainty. Marco's medical knowledge was limited, but he'd sat through enough specialist consultations to know what Aurora's doctors had told him. Blind patients often developed enhanced hearing and spatial awareness, but nothing like this. This was beyond compensation. This was evolution. "How is she doing that?" he asked Isolde quietly. "She feels the air currents when the bags move," Isolde replied, pride evident in her voice. "The vibrations through the floor tell her where each target is positioned. Sound gives her distance and timing. She's learned to see the world through senses most people never fully develop." Aurora finished her demonstration with a spinning kick that sent the center bag swaying violently. She wasn't even breathing hard. "How many times did I hit each target, Papa?" Marco tried to remember. "I don't know, sweetheart. It happened so fast. 36 strikes total. 12 per bag, perfectly distributed. Isolde's been teaching me to count automatically while fighting. It helps with accuracy and energy management." Energy management. Aurora was using terminology that belonged in professional training facilities, not physical therapy sessions. Dr. Harrison said blind patients might develop slightly better hearing, Marco said carefully. He never mentioned anything like this. "Dr. Harrison works with people who've accepted limitations," Isolde replied. Aurora refused to accept them. Something in her tone made Marco turn to study her profile. She watched Aurora with an intensity that went beyond professional interest or even friendship. This was personal for her in a way he didn't understand. "Show him the defensive sequence," Isolde suggested. Aurora moved to the center of the mat again. Close your eyes, Papa. Try to grab me. Marco hesitated. I'm not going to attack my daughter. Not attack. Just try to touch my shoulder. Any approach you want. Against his better judgment, Marco closed his eyes and stepped toward where he thought Aurora stood. Before his hand could make contact, she'd somehow melted away from his reach. He tried again, moving faster this time. Aurora evaded him effortlessly, her movements so subtle that he barely heard her repositioning. When he opened his eyes, Aurora stood 3 feet to his left, grinning triumphantly. You moved like you were walking through molasses, Papa. I could feel your intentions before you even took a step. How? Your breathing changed when you decided to move forward, Isolde explained. Your weight shifted to your leading foot a full second before you stepped. Aurora's learned to read these micro-signals that most people never notice. Most people. But Isolde had noticed them, which meant she'd trained specifically to recognize and exploit such tells. Marco was beginning to understand that his daughter's instructor possessed knowledge that went far beyond recreational martial arts. The afternoon brought another revelation when Marco returned early from a meeting to find Aurora practicing alone while Isolde prepared dinner upstairs. He watched from the doorway as his daughter moved through complex forms with mechanical precision, her techniques flowing together in patterns that looked almost choreographed. When Aurora finished, she turned toward his hiding spot with uncanny accuracy. You've been watching for 6 minutes and 37 seconds, Papa. How did you know I was here? Your cologne. The way you breathe when you're trying to be quiet. The leather in your shoes makes a specific sound against the floor. Marco stepped into the light, shaking his head in amazement. When you lost your sight, did you know you'd develop abilities like this? Aurora's expression grew thoughtful. I knew I'd have to find new ways to navigate the world. But Isolde taught me that losing one sense doesn't make you disabled. It makes you different. And different can be better if you're willing to work for it. What else has she taught you? That confidence comes from competence, not from being protected. That fear is just information about threats, not a command to hide from them. Aurora paused, her face lighting up with genuine happiness. That I'm still me, Papa. Just a stronger version. The joy in his daughter's voice made Marco's throat tight. For 2 years, he'd watched Aurora struggle with depression and frustration, feeling helpless to restore the confident girl she'd been before the accident. Somehow, Isolde had accomplished what teams of specialists couldn't. That evening, Marco found himself paying closer attention to their dinner conversation. Isolde contributed little, as usual, but when Aurora mentioned reading about historical fighting techniques, their maid's responses revealed knowledge that seemed encyclopedic. Did you know that blind warriors were highly prized in some ancient cultures? Aurora asked between bites of perfectly prepared salmon. They were considered to have supernatural awareness, Isolde replied easily. Buddhist monasteries trained blind monks as guardians because they couldn't be distracted by visual illusions or intimidated by threatening appearances. Marco nearly choked on his wine. That's quite specific knowledge for someone with casual martial arts experience. Isolde met his eyes directly for the first time all evening. I read extensively, Mr. Bellini. History fascinates me. What else fascinates you? The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications Marco wasn't sure he was ready to explore. Isolde's green eyes held his gaze steadily, and he found himself noticing details he'd overlooked before. The intelligence that sharpened her features when she thought no one was watching. The controlled strength in her movements. The way she seemed to assess everything and everyone constantly, as if threat evaluation was as natural as breathing. Many things, she said quietly. Ancient philosophies. Strategic thinking. The way people reveal their true nature when they believe they're unobserved. The last comment felt like a challenge, though Marco couldn't determine what kind. Was she testing him? Warning him? Or simply acknowledging that they were both keeping secrets? Aurora yawned, breaking the strange tension that had developed between the adults. I'm tired, Papa. Training was intense today. As his daughter headed upstairs, Marco found himself alone with Isolde for the first time since discovering her secret lessons. She began clearing dishes with efficient movements, but he could sense her awareness of his scrutiny. The employment agency that sent you, he said casually. Sterling Domestic Services. I called them today. Isolde's hands never paused in their work. Oh. They have no record of placing anyone with your name in a position with my household. This time she did pause, her back still turned to him. Perhaps there was an administrative error. Perhaps. Or perhaps Isolde Vance isn't your real name. She turned to face him then, and Marco saw something flicker in her expression. Not fear exactly. More like resignation mixed with relief. Does it matter, Mr. Bellini? I've cared for your household and your daughter faithfully for 2 years. I've never stolen from you, betrayed your confidences, or brought harm to your family. No, Marco said slowly. But you've also never told me the truth about who you are. Isolde moved closer, and Marco caught a hint of her scent. Not perfume, but something clean and warm with an underlying sharpness that reminded him of winter air. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes that spoke of someone who'd spent considerable time outdoors in harsh conditions. Some truths are dangerous, Mr. Bellini. For everyone involved. Dangerous to whom? To people who've found peace in quiet places. Who've discovered that sometimes the most powerful thing you can be is invisible. The cryptic response should have frustrated him, but instead Marco found himself intrigued. This woman had appeared in his life like a ghost, transformed his daughter's capabilities beyond recognition, and now stood before him radiating competence and mystery in equal measure. Aurora trusts you, he said finally. Aurora sees clearly, even without sight. And what do you see when you look at me? Isolde's gaze traveled over his face with an intensity that made his pulse quicken. I see a man who spent 5 years trying to build something legitimate from a foundation of violence. Who loves his daughter more than his own safety. Who's forgotten what it feels like to have someone understand the weight he carries. The accuracy of her assessment hit him like a physical blow. How could she read him so clearly when they'd barely exchanged more than pleasantries until yesterday? You don't know anything about the weight I carry, don't I? Isolde stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. I know what it's like to wake up every morning carrying responsibility for other people's safety. To make decisions where someone always gets hurt no matter what you choose. To build walls around the people you love, and then realize you've trapped yourself outside them. Marco stared at her, his heart hammering against his ribs. Who are you? Someone who understands you better than you might wish, Mr. Bellini. Before he could respond, she'd gathered the remaining dishes and disappeared into the kitchen, leaving him alone with questions that multiplied by the hour. Marco stood in his empty dining room, replaying every interaction he'd ever had with the mysterious woman who'd somehow become essential to his family's happiness. Tomorrow, he decided, he would get real answers. Tonight, he would try to understand why the thought of losing her felt almost as terrifying as the thought of keeping her. The call came at 6 in the morning, jolting Marco from the first decent sleep he'd managed in weeks. His security chief's voice carried the weight of bad news before he spoke a single word. We have a problem, boss. 3 families are moving against us. Marco sat up in bed, instantly alert. The Morettis, Volkovs, and De Santos had been circling his legitimate operations like sharks, scenting blood in the water. He'd hoped their harassment would remain economic, confined to blocking shipping contracts and bribing city inspectors. Apparently, hope was a luxury he could no longer afford. How serious? Satellite surveillance shows coordination. Meeting last night at the old warehouse district. Same vehicles, same time, different entrances. They're planning something big. Marco closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of his father's legacy settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. 5 years of building legitimate businesses, 5 years of refusing to solve problems with violence, and it meant nothing. His enemies would never see him as anything but Antonio Bellini's son. Double the perimeter guards. Cancel all external meetings for the rest of the week. I want a full tactical assessment on my desk by noon. Already in progress, sir. But boss, there's something else. Someone's been asking questions about your household staff. Specifically about the woman. Isolde. Marco's blood went cold. What kind of questions? Employment history. Real name. Previous addresses. Whoever's digging has resources and patience. Marco ended the call and dressed quickly, his mind racing through implications he didn't want to consider. If his enemies were investigating Isolde, they either suspected she was more than she appeared, or they were looking for leverage against him through Aurora. Either scenario meant his family was in immediate danger. He found Isolde in the kitchen preparing Aurora's breakfast, moving with the same quiet efficiency she displayed every morning for 2 years. But now Marco noticed details that had been invisible before. how she positioned herself to monitor both the window and doorway simultaneously. The way her hand instinctively checked the knife block's contents as she passed. Small habits that spoke of someone who'd lived in hostile environments where awareness meant survival. "We need to talk," he said quietly. Isolde glanced toward the stairs where Aurora would appear any moment for breakfast. "After you speak with your daughter, she'll sense tension if we're both distracted." The observation was accurate and unsettling. How did Isolde know Aurora's sensitivities better than he did? And why did her calm acceptance of crisis feel both reassuring and ominous? Aurora bounded down the stairs with unusual energy, her dark hair loose around her shoulders and a bright smile transforming her features. "Good morning, Papa." "Isolde, are we training early today? I had the most amazing dream about learning aerial techniques." Marco watched Isolde's face change almost imperceptibly. The professional mask she wore around him softened into genuine affection as she looked at Aurora. "After breakfast, little warrior. First you need fuel for all that energy." As Aurora chattered about her dreams and plans, Marco found himself studying their interaction with new eyes. Isolde anticipated his daughter's needs before Aurora voiced them, adjusting her plate's position so Aurora's hand found it perfectly, quietly moving obstacles from her path around the kitchen. This wasn't just attentive service. This was protective instinct operating at an almost supernatural level. When Aurora finished eating and headed upstairs to dress, Marco gestured for Isolde to follow him into his study. She closed the door behind them and turned to face him, her expression already shifting into something more guarded. "Someone's been investigating you. My enemies know you exist, and they're asking questions." Isolde was silent for a long moment, but Marco could see her mind working behind those green eyes, processing threats, calculating risks, developing responses. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a new quality he'd never heard before, something hard and dangerous that made the hair on his neck rise. "What kind of questions?" "Real name, employment history, background. Professional inquiry, not casual curiosity." Isolde moved to the window, her gaze sweeping the grounds with tactical precision. "How many families are moving against you?" 3. Coordinated assault planned for this week, according to intelligence reports. She turned back to him, and Marco felt his breath catch. The mild-mannered domestic worker had vanished completely. In her place stood someone who radiated lethal competence, analyzing threats and formulating responses with military efficiency. "Your perimeter security is inadequate for sustained assault," she said matter-of-factly. "Single fence line with too much open ground between monitoring posts. Guards are positioned for deterrence, not defense. Easy to breach from the north side where the service road provides cover." Marco stared at her. "How the hell do you know my security layout?" "I've observed it for 2 years, Mr. Bellini. It's my job to keep Aurora safe. Your job is housekeeping and cooking." Isolde's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "My job is whatever it needs to be to protect the people I care about." The words hung between them, loaded with implications that made Marco's pulse race. Care about. Not employed by or responsible for. Care about. Who are you? He asked for the 3rd time in 2 days. Before Isolde could answer, Aurora appeared in the doorway with the uncanny timing she'd developed since losing her sight. "Papa, why does your heartbeat sound different?" And Isolde, "You smell like metal and electricity when you're angry." Marco had no idea how Aurora could detect such subtle changes, but her observations were disturbingly accurate. His heart was hammering, and Isolde did seem charged with some kind of dangerous energy. "We're discussing security, sweetheart," Marco said carefully, "making sure everyone stays safe." Aurora's expression grew serious. "Because of the men who've been watching the house?" Both adults froze. "What men?" Marco asked. "Black sedan, parked at the corner for 3 days running. Different shifts, but same license plate." Aurora moved further into the room with perfect confidence. "They think they're being subtle, but they don't understand how sound carries. I can hear them talking through open windows." Marco felt ice forming in his stomach. "Aurora, why didn't you tell me about this?" "Because Isolde said she was handling it," Aurora replied with perfect trust. "She's been tracking their patterns and taking pictures." Marco turned to Isolde, whose expression had gone completely neutral. "Taking pictures. Evidence gathering," Isolde said calmly. "Professional surveillance requires professional documentation. You've been conducting counter-surveillance operations without my knowledge." To protect Aurora. Your security team never noticed them. That last comment stung because it was accurate. His expensive security consultants had missed obvious surveillance while his blind daughter and mysterious maid had not only detected it, but were actively gathering intelligence. Show me the pictures. Isolde produced a small digital camera from somewhere in her dress. The images were professionally composed, clearly shot with telephoto lens from concealment. License plates, faces, shift changes, all documented with military precision. How long have you known they were there? Marco asked Aurora. Since Tuesday, Aurora said. But Isolde's known since Monday. Because you saw them first, Isolde said gently. Aurora beamed with pride. My hearing is getting better every day. Marco studied the photographs, recognizing two of the men as Moretti enforcers. His enemies were no longer content with economic pressure. They were preparing for direct action, and they'd been studying his family for days. We need to increase security immediately, he said. Security won't be enough, Isolde replied quietly. They're not planning kidnapping or intimidation. This is reconnaissance for elimination. The clinical way she delivered that assessment sent chills down Marco's spine. Elimination. Professional terminology from someone who understood exactly what it meant. How do you know? Because I recognize the pattern. Isolde's voice carried grim certainty. Extended surveillance to establish routines, shift changes to identify vulnerabilities, multiple teams to ensure complete coverage. This is preparation for a kill operation. Aurora had gone very still, her head tilted as if listening to something beyond normal hearing. They're planning to hurt us? Some people believe violence solves problems, Isolde said, moving to Aurora's side with protective instinct. They're wrong, but they're also dangerous. Then we fight back, Aurora declared with stunning matter-of-fact certainty. You've been training me for real threats, haven't you? Not just exercise. Isolde glanced at Marco before responding. Yes, little warrior. Real threats require real preparation. Marco watched his daughter process this information with composure that would have impressed seasoned soldiers. When had Aurora become someone who could discuss assassination attempts without panic? I want to learn everything, Aurora said firmly. Not just basic techniques. Everything you know. Aurora, Marco started, but Isolde held up a hand. She needs advanced training now, not eventually. These people won't hesitate to use her against you, Mr. Bellini. The only way to protect her is to make her capable of protecting herself. The logic was sound but terrifying. Marco was watching his daughter's childhood disappear in real time, replaced by necessities he'd hoped she'd never face. What kind of advanced training? Weapons, tactical movement, escape and evasion, combat psychology. Isolde's response was immediate and comprehensive. She'll need to function independently if we become separated during an attack. We. Marco caught the pronoun and its implications. You're planning to stay and fight. Where else would I go? Isolde's green eyes met his directly. This is my family now. The simple statement hit Marco with unexpected force. Family. Not employer, not job, not obligation. Family. Then we do this together, Aurora announced with growing excitement. All three of us. They think we're weak because I'm blind and Isolde's just a maid. They have no idea what they're really facing. Marco looked at his daughter's fierce expression, then at Isolde's deadly calm competence. Aurora was right. Their enemies had no idea what they were facing. But neither did he. Training starts immediately, he heard himself saying. Full tactical preparation. But Isolde, I want complete honesty about your background. If we're going to trust our lives to your expertise, I need to know exactly what that expertise includes. Isolde nodded slowly. Fair enough, Mr. Bellini. But some truths come with consequences you might not be prepared for. Try me. Tonight, then. After Aurora's training session. You'll have your answers. That afternoon, Marco watched from the basement doorway as Isolde put Aurora through exercises that looked more like special forces conditioning than martial arts training. His daughter moved through complex scenarios with growing confidence, responding to verbal commands that seemed to activate muscle memory she shouldn't possess. Incoming from 2 o'clock, Isolde called out. Multiple hostiles. Aurora dropped into a defensive crouch and rolled left, coming up in perfect position to strike an imaginary attacker while maintaining awareness of additional threats. Her movements were fluid, economical, lethal. When had his blind daughter become a weapon? More importantly, who had taught her to move like someone who'd been born to violence? As Aurora worked through scenarios that grew increasingly sophisticated, Marco found himself watching Isolde with new understanding. Every correction she offered came from personal experience. Every technique she demonstrated had been tested under conditions where failure meant death. Tonight, he would finally learn the truth about the woman who'd become essential to his family's survival. Tomorrow, they would find out whether that truth was enough to keep them alive. The training session that evening was unlike anything Marco had witnessed before. Isolde had transformed the basement into a tactical obstacle course, moving furniture and equipment to create a maze of barriers that required Aurora to navigate while defending against multiple simulated attacks. Aurora moved through the course with fluid grace, her enhanced senses mapping every surface and angle. She rolled under tables, vaulted over chairs, and struck practice targets with devastating precision while maintaining perfect spatial awareness of her environment. Marco found himself holding his breath as his daughter executed maneuvers that belonged in military special forces training, not physical therapy for a blind teenager. Every movement demonstrated months of intensive preparation he'd never suspected. Contact left, Isolde called sharply. Two hostiles closing fast. Aurora dropped into a defensive crouch and pivoted toward the imaginary threat, her hands moving in a complex pattern that would have disabled any real attacker who got within range. Her face was completely focused, showing none of the hesitation or uncertainty that had plagued her since the accident. How is she doing this? Marco asked quietly. She stopped thinking of blindness as disability, Isolde replied without taking her eyes off Aurora. She's learned to see obstacles as opportunities, limitations as advantages. And you taught her that philosophy. Someone taught me that philosophy. I'm simply passing it along. Before Marco could ask who that someone had been, Aurora completed the course and turned toward them with a triumphant smile. How was my time? 47 seconds, Isolde announced with genuine pride. Personal best. Aurora pumped her fist in celebration, then froze as a new sound reached her enhanced hearing. Car engines. Multiple vehicles approaching fast. Papa, she said urgently. For cars, different engine signatures. They're not using the main road. Marco's blood went ice cold. His security team should have intercepted any unauthorized vehicles long before they reached the house. Either his perimeter had been compromised or his men were already dead. Basement lockdown, he ordered, pulling his concealed pistol. Aurora, behind the reinforced storage room. Now. But instead of moving towards safety, Aurora stepped closer to Isolde with complete trust. What do we do? Isolde was already moving, her entire demeanor shifting into something predatory and focused. The mild-mannered maid had vanished, replaced by someone who radiated lethal competence. Aurora, emergency position 3. Stay low, stay quiet, follow my voice commands only. Aurora nodded and moved to a corner position that provided maximum cover while maintaining escape routes. The coordination between them was seamless, clearly practiced. How many scenarios have you two drilled? Marco demanded. Enough, Isolde replied, producing a knife from somewhere in her dress. The blade was military grade, designed for close combat efficiency rather than intimidation. The sound of splintering would echo from upstairs as the front door gave way. Heavy footsteps thundered across the marble floors, spreading through the house with tactical precision. At least 8 men, possibly more. They know the layout, Marco realized with sick certainty. Someone had provided detailed floor plans to his enemies. Isolde moved toward the basement side entrance with fluid steps that made no sound whatsoever. She gestured for Marco to take position near Aurora, then began checking the locks with professional efficiency. The first explosion shook dust from the ceiling beams. Flashbangs designed to disorient rather than destroy. These weren't random thugs looking for quick violence. This was a coordinated assault by professionals who wanted their targets alive. Stay together, Marco ordered, but Isolde was already shaking her head. They'll concentrate fire on you if we cluster. I draw them away, you protect Aurora. You're not trained for this, Marco said, even as he recognized the absurdity of that statement. Everything about Isolde's movements screamed advanced combat training. The basement door at the top of the stairs exploded inward. 3 men in tactical gear descended rapidly, their movements coordinated and efficient. Marco raised his pistol, but before he could fire, Isolde was already in motion. What happened next defied everything Marco thought he understood about human capability. Isolde flowed up the stairs like smoke made solid, reaching the lead attacker before he could fully process her movement. The knife in her hand moved in patterns too fast to track, and suddenly the man was falling backward into his companions. The second attacker tried to bring his rifle around, but Isolde had somehow gotten inside his reach. Her elbow connected with his solar plexus while her knife found the gap in his armor with surgical precision. He collapsed without making a sound. The third man managed to fire a single shot before Isolde's hand clamped over his mouth, and the knife ended his participation in the assault. All three attackers were neutralized in less than 10 seconds of completely silent violence. Marco stared up at her, his mind struggling to process what he'd just witnessed. That wasn't self-defense or even advanced martial arts. That was the work of someone who'd dedicated years to perfecting human destruction as an art form. Isolde descended the stairs, checking her clothing for tears or bloodstains with clinical detachment. She'd killed 3 armed professionals without breaking a sweat or making enough noise to alert their companions upstairs. "Papa," Aurora whispered from her corner position. "Are you hurt?" "No, sweetheart. We're safe for now." But his eyes never left Isolde, who was examining the dead men's equipment with professional interest. She pulled radios, spare ammunition, and what looked like building schematics from their gear. "How many more upstairs?" Marco asked. "At least 5, based on radio chatter. Possibly 7. Isolde's voice was completely calm, as if discussing weather rather than tactical assessment of an active assault. "We need to call for backup. Your phone lines are cut, your cellular service is jammed, and your security team is likely compromised." Isolde met his gaze directly. "We're on our own, Mr. Bellini." "Then how do we get out of this?" "We don't get out. We win." The absolute certainty in her voice sent chills down Marco's spine. This wasn't bravado or desperate hope. This was the confidence of someone who'd faced similar situations and emerged victorious. As if in response to his thoughts, Isolde began stripping off her conservative dress. Underneath, she wore form-fitting black clothes that looked designed for tactical movement. But it was what Marco saw on her exposed skin that made his world tilt sideways. Scars. Professional ones that told stories of knife fights and bullet wounds. But more than that, covering her left shoulder blade, was a tattoo that made his blood turn to ice water. A white wolf's head, rendered in intricate detail with silver-gray shading. Below it, in script that looked Russian, were words Marco couldn't read but somehow recognized. That symbol. He'd seen it before, years ago, in a world he'd tried to forget. "You're her," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You're the White Wolf." Isolde's hands stilled on her equipment. She didn't deny it. Aurora's head turned toward them with sharp interest. "The White Wolf? Like in the stories?" Stories. Aurora had heard stories about the legendary underground fighter who dominated the circuit for 3 years before vanishing without explanation. The ghost who'd never lost a match, never been identified, never been caught. "That's impossible," Marco said, even as the evidence stared him in the face. "The White Wolf disappeared 5 years ago. Just vanished from competition. Because her brother died," Aurora said quietly, her enhanced hearing having caught details that normal ears would miss. "That's what the stories always said." The wolf fought until her pack was gone, then she faded into the shadows. Marco felt the world shift beneath his feet. Isolde's brother. The underground fighting circuit. His father's involvement in that world during the last years of his life. "The De Santos tournament," he said with growing horror. 5 years ago. The fixed fight that killed Alexei Vance. Isolde turned to face him fully, and Marco saw death in her green eyes. "So you know, my father funded that tournament. He put money on De Santos's fighter even though everyone knew Alexei was the better man." "Your father did more than fund it," Isolde said with quiet venom. "He suggested the solution when it became clear his investment was about to lose." Marco's stomach dropped into his shoes. The solution. His father's euphemism for arranging accidents that eliminated inconvenient obstacles. "The poison," Marco whispered, "in Alexei's water bottle between rounds. It was supposed to slow him down, not kill him. But my brother's heart was already damaged from years of fighting. The dose that should have weakened him for 1 match stopped it completely." Aurora had gone very still in her corner, listening to revelations that redefined everything she thought she knew about her family. You came here for revenge, Marco said with sudden clarity. 2 years ago, you came to kill me. Isolde's smile was sharp as winter wind. I came to destroy Antonio Bellini's legacy. His son seemed like an appropriate place to start. But you didn't. No. Isolde's expression softened as she looked toward Aurora. I didn't. Why? Because the man I came to destroy was already gone. You'd spent 5 years dismantling everything your father built, creating something legitimate from the ashes. And because... She stopped, but Marco could see the struggle in her face. Because what? Because your daughter needed someone who understood that strength doesn't come from what you can destroy. It comes from what you choose to protect. Aurora rose from her position and moved toward them with perfect confidence. So you stayed to teach me how to fight. I stayed to teach you how to survive, Isolde corrected gently. In a world where people like me exist. Marco studied the woman who'd spent 2 years planning his destruction while simultaneously healing his daughter. The legendary fighter who'd terrorized the underground circuit was the same gentle soul who'd served his morning coffee and listened to Aurora's dreams. You could have killed me anytime, he said. Every day for 2 years, Isolde confirmed without emotion. Dozens of opportunities. Poison in your food, a blade between your ribs, an accident that no one would question. But instead you made my daughter stronger than she'd ever been. You gave her confidence and capability. You made our house a home. Because somewhere along the way, destroying Antonio Bellini's son became less important than protecting Marco Bellini's daughter. The sound of footsteps on the main floor reminded them that emotional revelations would have to wait. There were still enemies in the house, and Aurora's safety remained the priority. What now? Marco asked. Now we do what wolves do best, Isolde replied, her voice carrying lethal promise. We hunt in a pack. Aurora stepped forward, her face set with determination that would have been frightening if Marco didn't know she was his daughter. All 3 of us, she said firmly. Family protects family. Marco looked at his blind daughter and the legendary killer who'd become her protector. His enemies had no idea what they'd unleashed by threatening the people he loved. Together, then, he said, checking his ammunition. Let's show them what happens when they attack our pack. Isolde's smile was all teeth and anticipation. Welcome to the hunt, Mr. Bellini. The White Wolf was about to remind the world why legends never truly die. The silence that followed Isolde's revelation stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with years of hidden pain and carefully concealed truths. Marco stared at the woman who'd spent 2 years living in his house, caring for his daughter, planning his destruction while simultaneously healing his family in ways he'd never imagined possible. Aurora broke the tension with characteristic directness. So you came here to kill Papa, but you stayed because you love me. It's more complicated than that, sweetheart, Marco said carefully, his eyes never leaving Isolde's face. No, it's not. Aurora moved toward them with perfect confidence despite the chaos surrounding them upstairs. Love changes everything. That's what you taught me, Isolde. That strength comes from protecting the people who matter. Isolde's carefully constructed composure cracked slightly, revealing glimpses of the pain she'd carried for 5 years. Your brother would be proud of who you've become. He would have loved Aurora, Isolde replied quietly. Alexei always said children were the only pure thing left in our world. Marco felt the weight of his father's sins pressing down on his shoulders like lead. I can't undo what happened to your brother. If I could trade my father's life for his, I would. But you're not your father, Aurora said with stunning clarity. You're the man who spent 5 years building legitimate businesses instead of expanding a criminal empire. You're the man who chose to protect people instead of destroying them. The footsteps above had grown quieter, suggesting their remaining enemies were conducting a methodical search rather than random destruction. Marco counted at least 4 distinct movement patterns, possibly more. They had minutes before the assault team discovered the basement access points. We need to move, he said. This position won't hold if they coordinate properly. They won't coordinate, Isolde said with grim certainty. These aren't professional soldiers. They're criminals who've watched too many military movies. They'll make mistakes. How can you be sure? Because I've been tracking their operations for 6 months. The Moretus, Volkovs, and DeSantos families have been planning this alliance, but they don't trust each other. Each family wants to be the one who eliminates you personally. 6 months. Marco processed the implications. You've been conducting surveillance on my enemies while living in my house. Protecting your family requires understanding the threats against it. Isolde checked her equipment with practiced efficiency. These three families didn't just decide to move against you randomly. Someone's been feeding them intelligence, coordinating their efforts, promising them access to your shipping networks. Who? The same person who arranged your brother's death, Aurora said quietly, and who's been hunting down everyone who knew about the tournament fix. Both adults turned to stare at her. How do you know that? Because I listen, Aurora replied simply. Phone calls you think are private, conversations with your security team, meetings you have in the study. Sound carries differently than you realize, and I've learned to interpret what I hear. Marco felt a chill that had nothing to do with the basement's temperature. What else have you heard? That someone's been eliminating witnesses to what happened 5 years ago. 3 former DeSantos associates died in accidents over the past year. The referee from Alexei's last fight disappeared. Even the arena owner suffered a convenient heart attack. Isolde had gone very still, her face pale with understanding. They're covering their tracks, removing everyone who could testify about the murder. Which means you're both targets, Aurora concluded with devastating logic. Isolde because she's Alexei's sister, and Papa because you inherited knowledge about Father's involvement. The sound of splintering would echoed from the kitchen above, followed by shouted commands in multiple languages. The assault team was expanding their search pattern, growing frustrated with their inability to locate their primary targets. We can't run from this, Marco said with growing certainty. Even if we escape tonight, they'll keep coming. More resources, better planning. Eventually they'll succeed. So we end it here, Isolde replied, her voice carrying the cold promise of violence. All of it. Tonight. Aurora stepped closer to them, her face set with determination that reminded Marco painfully of her mother. I want to fight with you. Not hide while you protect me. Fight. Absolutely not, Marco said automatically. She's ready, Isolde countered quietly. More ready than most adults would be in this situation. She's 17 years old and blind. I'm also standing right here, Aurora said with growing irritation. And I'm not helpless anymore. Show him, Isolde. Before Marco could object, Isolde moved into an attack position with fluid grace. What followed was unlike anything he'd ever imagined possible. Aurora responded to Isolde's assault with techniques that belonged in Special Forces training, not physical therapy sessions. The two women moved together like dancers performing a deadly ballet. Each strike met with perfect defense, each defensive maneuver flowing into lethal counterattack. Aurora's blindness became an advantage, allowing her to anticipate Isolde's movements through sound and air displacement, while Isolde couldn't use visual tricks to mislead her. For 3 minutes they fought with increasing intensity, neither gaining significant advantage until Aurora executed a complex maneuver that caught Isolde off guard. Suddenly, the legendary White Wolf found herself pinned to the mat, Aurora's arm across her throat in a submission hold that would have rendered her unconscious in seconds. Yield, Aurora said calmly. I yield, Isolde replied with genuine pride. Perfectly executed, little warrior. Marco stared at his daughter, who just defeated one of the most dangerous fighters in the world through skill rather than luck. When had Aurora become capable of this level of combat? Now you understand, Isolde said as Aurora helped her to her feet. She's not the helpless victim they expect to find. She's a weapon that looks like a liability. The tactical advantage was obvious and terrifying. No enemy would consider a blind teenager a legitimate threat until she was already neutralizing them. But the thought of Aurora in combat made Marco's protective instincts scream in protest. I know you're scared, Papa, Aurora said gently, somehow reading his internal struggle. But hiding me won't keep me safe anymore. They know I exist, they know you love me, and they'll use me against you if they can. The only way to protect our family is to make sure I can protect myself. The logic was sound but devastating. His daughter was right, and that knowledge felt like a knife between his ribs. Fine, he heard himself saying. But we do this together. No separation, no heroic sacrifices, no unnecessary risks. Agreed, Isolde said immediately. The sound of metal against stone echoed from the main basement entrance. Someone was testing the reinforced door, probing for weaknesses. They had minutes before the assault team breached their position. What's our tactical situation? Marco asked. 7 hostiles confirmed, Isolde replied while checking her weapons. Moretti family leads with 4 men, Volkov provides 2 specialists. DeSantos sent 1 overseer to ensure you die personally. How do you know their composition so precisely? Because I've been tracking them individually for months, building profiles on their capabilities and weaknesses. Isolde's smile was sharp as winter steel. They have no idea they've been hunted by their intended prey. Aurora moved to an equipment case Marco had never noticed before, producing items that definitely didn't belong in any household inventory. Night vision goggles designed for someone with enhanced hearing rather than sight. Communication equipment that looked military-grade. Weapons that seemed perfectly balanced for her height and reach. How long have you two been preparing for this? Marco demanded. Since the day I realized someone was coordinating efforts against your family, Isolde replied. Aurora insisted on learning everything, not just basic self-defense. Because I knew this moment would come eventually, Aurora added with disturbing calm. Bad people never stop being bad until someone makes them stop. The basement door gave way with a thunderous crash, followed by the sound of tactical boots on concrete stairs. Time for planning had expired. Time for violence had arrived. Marco checked his pistol and moved into position, his heart hammering against his ribs. In 30 seconds, he would discover whether 2 years of secret training and careful preparation would be enough to save his family. Beside him, Isolde transformed into the white wolf with predatory grace, every movement promising death to anyone who threatened her pack. Aurora settled into a defensive stance that radiated lethal competence despite her 17 years and damaged vision. His enemies thought they were attacking a legitimate businessman, his domestic servant, and his disabled daughter. They had no idea they were about to face a former crime prince, a legendary killer, and a blind warrior who'd learned to turn her greatest weakness into her deadliest strength. Let them come, Aurora whispered with anticipation that should have terrified him, but instead filled him with fierce pride. For the first time in 5 years, Marco Bellini felt like he was exactly where he belonged, standing with his pack, ready to fight for everything that mattered. The hunt was about to begin, and his enemies were the prey. The first man through the basement door never saw Aurora coming. He descended the stairs with tactical precision, rifle raised and night vision engaged, scanning for 3 helpless targets cowering in the darkness. Instead, he found 17 years of suppressed rage and months of intensive training condensed into 5 feet 6 inches of lethal precision. Aurora moved like smoke made deadly, her enhanced senses tracking his position through the sound of his breathing and the metallic tang of his equipment. She struck from his blind spot with surgical accuracy, her elbow connecting with the precise nerve cluster that would drop him instantly without giving him time to cry out. The second attacker realized something was wrong when his partner's radio went silent, but by then Isolde was already among them. The white wolf had returned to her element, moving through the confined space with predatory grace that turned the basement into a killing field. Marco watched in stunned amazement as his daughter and the woman he'd fallen in love with dismantled a professional assault team with coordinated efficiency. This wasn't random violence or desperate defense. This was artistry. Deadly, beautiful, terrifying artistry. 3 more men made it halfway down the stairs before Aurora's enhanced hearing detected their approach. She signaled Isolde with subtle hand movements they'd obviously practiced countless times, positioning herself to strike while the legendary fighter prepared to eliminate multiple targets simultaneously. What followed defied every assumption Marco had ever made about combat, disability, and the limits of human capability. Aurora used her blindness as a tactical advantage, moving through complete darkness while their enemies fumbled with equipment designed for sight-based engagement. She struck from angles they couldn't anticipate because they couldn't imagine how someone without vision could navigate so flawlessly through 3-dimensional space. Isolde fought like the legend she'd become, every movement economical and devastating. She'd studied each enemy for months, learning their patterns and weaknesses, turning their own tactics against them with surgical precision. The knife in her hand became an extension of her will, ending threats before they could fully materialize. Within 8 minutes, 6 professional killers lay motionless on the basement floor. But Marco knew the deadliest enemy remained upstairs. Vincent DeSantos hadn't sent expendable foot soldiers to handle his most important business. The man who'd orchestrated Alexei's murder 5 years ago was somewhere in the house, waiting to finish what he'd started. He's in the study, Aurora said quietly, her enhanced hearing having tracked movement patterns through the house's acoustic signature. One person, heavy footsteps, moving slowly. He wants us to come to him. It's a trap, Marco replied automatically. Of course it's a trap, Isolde agreed with grim satisfaction. But Vincent doesn't understand what he's really caught. They moved through the house like a coordinated unit, Aurora leading with her superior environmental awareness while Isolde and Marco provided tactical support. Marco found himself marveling at how naturally they functioned together, as if they'd been fighting as a team for years rather than hours. The study door stood open, warm light spilling into the darkened hallway. Vincent DeSantos sat behind Marco's own desk like a conquering king claiming his throne, a glass of Marco's best whiskey in one hand and a pistol in the other. His smile was all teeth and malice. The prodigal son returns to face justice for his father's crimes. Marco stepped into the room with Aurora and Isolde flanking him like bodyguards. Up close, Vincent looked older than his 63 years, his once powerful frame reduced by decades of excess and paranoia. But his eyes remained sharp and calculating. "You killed my brother," Isolde said with deadly quiet. "Your brother was a complication that required resolution," Vincent replied dismissively. Antonio understood the necessities of business. Unfortunately, his son lacks that pragmatic wisdom. Marco felt rage building in his chest like pressure in a boiler. "You murdered an innocent man to fix a rigged fight." "Innocent?" Vincent laughed, the sound harsh and grating. "Your brother was a killer, girl. A weapon pointed at anyone who paid his handlers enough. His death removed a dangerous variable from the equation." Aurora stepped forward slightly, her face calm despite the violence that had filled the past hour. "You've been killing witnesses for 5 years. Cleaning up evidence. But you missed something." Vincent's expression shifted slightly, uncertainty flickering behind his arrogant mask. "What could a blind child possibly know about my business?" "That you recorded everything," Aurora said with stunning confidence. "Insurance against your partners. Proof of who ordered what and when. The recording of you instructing father about how much poison to use on Alexei." Marco's blood went cold. Recording. His father had been paranoid about documentation, maintaining detailed records of every transaction and agreement. If Vincent had been equally careful about preserving evidence of their conspiracy. Aurora moved toward the desk with perfect confidence, her hand finding the hidden panel in its base that Marco had forgotten existed. Inside, exactly where his father would have placed it, was a digital recorder that had been running silently for years. Vincent raised his pistol with shaking hands, but Isolde was already moving. The legendary white wolf crossed the space between them with inhuman speed, her knife finding his wrist before he could complete his aim. The gun clattered to the floor as Vincent screamed in pain and fury. "You think you've won?" He gasped as Isolde applied pressure to nerve points that kept him conscious but helpless. "The Moretus and Volkovs won't stop because I'm gone. They'll keep coming until your entire family is dead." "Actually, they won't," Aurora said calmly, producing a cell phone that seemed far too sophisticated for a teenager to own. "Because 30 minutes ago, this recording was uploaded to FBI servers along with financial documents linking all 3 families to federal racketeering charges." Marco stared at his daughter in amazement. "When did you become capable of conducting federal investigations?" "Isolde taught me that information is the most powerful weapon," Aurora replied with satisfaction. "While you two were dealing with the assault team, I was ensuring our enemies couldn't regroup." Vincent's face went gray as the implications sank in. His carefully constructed criminal network, 5 years of murder and intimidation, decades of illegal operations, all undone by a blind teenager with enhanced hearing and federal law enforcement contacts he'd never suspected existed. "How?" he whispered. "Because someone who can hear conversations through closed doors and identify voices through electronic filters makes an excellent intelligence asset," Isolde explained with grim satisfaction. "Aurora's been documenting criminal communications for months, building cases against everyone who threatened this family." Marco looked at Aurora and Isolde with new understanding. They hadn't just been preparing for tonight's assault. They'd been systematically dismantling the entire network that had targeted his family, using Aurora's unique capabilities to gather evidence that would have been impossible to obtain through conventional surveillance. "It's over, Vincent," Marco said with finality. "Your organization is finished, Your partners are facing federal charges, and justice for Alexei will finally be served. Vincent's expression twisted with rage and desperation. You think this ends anything? I made your father into a killer. I corrupted everything he touched. You're just another poisoned branch of the same rotten tree. The words hit Marco like physical blows, carrying the weight of every doubt he'd harbored about his own nature and the possibility of redemption. For a moment, his father's shadow seemed to loom over everything he'd tried to build. Then Aurora stepped forward and placed her hand on his arm, her touch warm and steady and absolutely certain. Papa, you're nothing like grandfather. You spent 5 years building something good from the wreckage he left behind. You chose love over fear, protection over destruction, family over power. That's not poison. That's healing. Isolde moved to his other side, her presence solid and reassuring despite the violence that had defined their evening. Vincent's wrong about you, Marco. You're not Antonio's son anymore. You're Aurora's father. That makes all the difference. Marco felt something fundamental shift inside his chest, years of guilt and self-doubt finally releasing their hold on his heart. He looked at Aurora's confident face and Isolde's determined expression and realized that Vincent was right about one thing. This was the end, not just of tonight's threat, but of the shadow his father's legacy had cast over his life. The sound of sirens in the distance announced the arrival of federal agents who would handle Vincent and any surviving members of his assault team. Justice would be served through legal channels rather than private vengeance, completing the transformation from his father's world to something better. 6 months later, Marco stood in the backyard of their new home, watching Aurora demonstrate defensive techniques to a group of children whose disabilities had been transformed into advantages through careful training and unlimited patience. She moved among them like a gentle teacher, encouraging and correcting with the same mixture of firmness and compassion that Isolde had shown her. The children adored her. Parents drove from 3 states to enroll their sons and daughters in Aurora's program, desperate for someone who could show their kids that limitations were just starting points for developing different kinds of strength. Have you ever wondered how tragedy can become triumph when the right person believes in impossible possibilities? Sometimes the greatest teachers are those who've learned to transform their deepest wounds into their greatest gifts. Isolde emerged from the house carrying glasses of lemonade, her hair loose around her shoulders and her face relaxed in ways Marco had never seen during their dangerous months together. She wore a simple sundress that revealed the faded scars on her arms, marks she no longer bothered to hide now that their story was known. How many new applications today? Marco asked as she settled beside him on the porch swing. 17, Isolde replied with satisfaction. Word is spreading about what Aurora can accomplish with students everyone else has given up on. They watched Aurora help a 10-year-old boy with cerebral palsy execute a perfect defensive maneuver, his face glowing with pride at his accomplishment. The child's parents stood nearby, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed capabilities in their son that medical professionals had declared impossible. She's going to change how the world sees disability, Marco said with fierce pride. She already has, Isolde corrected gently, at least for the people who matter. Marco turned to study the woman who'd become his wife 3 months ago in a ceremony that included federal agents as wedding guests and Aurora as both maid of honor and security coordinator. Isolde wore her wedding ring like armor, a symbol of belonging she'd never expected to claim. Any regrets about choosing this life over revenge? Isolde considered the question seriously, as she did everything that mattered. Alexei wanted me to be happy more than he wanted me to be dangerous. This makes me happy in ways I'd forgotten were possible. Aurora called out to them from across the yard. Papa, Isolde, watch this. Today we're learning advanced evasion. What followed was a demonstration that would have impressed Special Forces instructors. 8 children with various disabilities moved through an obstacle course with precision and confidence that transformed their limitations into strategic advantages. Aurora guided them with gentle commands and encouraging words, teaching them that different didn't mean lesser. That's our daughter, Marco said with overwhelming love. Our daughter, Isolde agreed, the possessive pronoun carrying all the commitment and protection she'd once reserved for revenge. As evening approached and the last students departed with their amazed parents, Aurora joined them on the porch with the satisfied exhaustion of someone who'd found their true calling. Good day? Marco asked. The best, Aurora replied, settling between them with perfect contentment. Timothy's parents are enrolling him in regular martial arts classes next month. Maria wants to try competitive swimming. David asked if I thought he could become a teacher like me someday. And what did you tell David? That he could become anything he was willing to work for, Aurora said simply. That limitations are just information about current capabilities, not permanent judgments about future possibilities. Marco wrapped his arms around both women, marveling at how a night of violence had transformed into a lifetime of healing. His father's legacy had been destruction and fear. His own legacy was becoming love and empowerment, carried forward through a daughter who saw possibilities where others saw problems. Isolde leaned against his shoulder, her contentment evident in every relaxed line of her body. The white wolf had found her pack, and the pack had found their purpose. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Aurora spoke quietly about her dreams for expanding the program, helping more children discover their hidden strengths. Marco listened with growing amazement at his daughter's vision and determination. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the greatest victories weren't won through violence, but through the patient transformation of weakness into strength. Tonight, he was simply grateful to be surrounded by the two people who'd taught him that family wasn't about blood or obligation. It was about choosing to protect, empower, and love each other regardless of the cost. The Bellini family had found their happily ever after, and it looked exactly like hope made real.